I have been an activist my entire life. That's all I've ever done. So I started doing organizing protests and campaigns when I was 13. So the very first thing I did is I refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which is a kind of mandatory pledge before class begins in public schools in America.
Why did you refuse to do that?
When you're 13, honestly, the reasons are never quite as rational as at my age, looking back, I can give you eloquent reasons, but, disobedience, dissatisfaction with how I didn't feel like I fit in. And then the words of the Pledge of Allegiance give a very glorified story of, liberty and equality for all and all this kind of stuff. So, but rebellious spirit.
The name.
I was 17 in 1999, and I had been an activist for a while, but I was reading a magazine. My story is I was reading a magazine called Adbusters, and Adbusters has been talking about a social protest that was going to happen in Seattle in 1999. And when it did actually happen and it emerged as like this amazing thing, I became a devotee of Adbusters, and that's ultimately where Occupy Wall Street came from. It was a call put out by Adbusters magazine. So from the Seattle protests, it brought me into Adbusters magazine. I started to work there, and then so many years later, we created Occupy Wall Street. So I was a high school student, and it showed me the power and the capacity of disciplined militants to disrupt global structures through like kind of coordinated action. And their kind of non-hierarchical format is what really influenced Occupy, I think, in their consensus-based assemblies.
Micah, same question to you. What did it mean, in a sense, to feel this sort of, as a co-founder of Occupy, that sort of personal responsibility? And did you suffer from burnout in the end?
Well, absolutely, burnout is one of the great challenges of activism. I've been an activist since, like I said, since I was 13, and as I get older and older, I see fewer and fewer activists. I think that, though, it's important to not overestimate the role of individual activists in creating these social movements. I think that a lot of times, activists, we take credit for things that might be structural forces outside of our control. For example, like the birth of Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring might have more to do with food prices than with the specific actions of activists calling for social change and all this kind of stuff. So I think that it is important to kind of, the way that I avoid burnout is two things. One, the study of social movements and revolutions show that they tend to emerge when they seem least likely. So whenever I feel despondent and like I'm burned out, that's actually when I think that it's about to break out, like the movement's about to break out. This is true. Trotsky talks about this with the Russian Revolution. If you talk to people before Occupy Wall Street, they said, no, nothing's going to happen in our country. Even when the Arab Spring was breaking out, people said Occupy is never going to happen in our country. So similarly, I think that when you feel low is when possibilities emerge, and when we feel overconfident, when we start celebrating the effectiveness of social protests and all this kind of stuff, is when I start to get a little skeptical and start to feel like I need to pull back.
Perhaps, yes. Occupy wasn't obviously a march. It was an occupation. Why that tactic? Was that tactic particularly effective? And do you think actually it's those kinds of tactics which can be even more effective? Because it shows real dedication. Is that the thing?
Yeah, I think this gets back to like basically questions of theories of change behind activism.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the long history of social protest, like it's amazingly, we actually have records from ancient Egypt, so 5,000 years ago, that show that there's papyri that talk about the king being overthrown by the poor people in the streets. So we know that for the last 5,000 years, throughout periodically, the people go into the streets, they overthrow their governments and try to demand changes. But I think that if we look at the trajectory of social protest, how it's changed is that just definitely since the 20th century, social protest has stopped being about basically overthrowing the government and trying to replace it. And it started to be either try to influence the government that's in power, or even now, today, to become some sort of form of marketing and social marketing and trying to change the discourse and spread awareness and all this kind of stuff. So I think that the reason why, if you ask specifically, why did Occupy choose the General Assembly, consensus-based assembly model, is because we were trying to manifest a form of popular sovereignty. We were trying to manifest a form of popular will, a more direct form of democracy. And I think that ultimately that's what social protests are trying to do. Social protests are trying to assert a kind of people power, but specifically getting back to this question of the social contract, really like a popular will, or like Rousseau's concept of, the will of the people and all this kind of stuff. And that has been, at least the democratic myth, is that our governments are based on the consent of the governed. And that's what I think social movements have been trying to do, is demonstrate, well, you don't have our consent. And that's where things are breaking down.
just to go back, was it a deliberate tactic to say, you know what, we're going to just stay here, right? Stay on this spot right here.
Yeah, the Occupy specifically was the merging of two social movements. It was the merging of the Tahrir Square uprising, where the people went into Egypt and they said, we will not leave until Mubarak goes, and he did go. And with the Indignados in Spain, where they
Yes.
instead went into the squares and they said, we're going to hold these assemblies and demonstrate a superior form of democracy. We wanted to demonstrate that there is another form of democracy. And Occupy did both. So it said, let's go to a place of symbolic importance, which is the financial districts, and let's hold these general assemblies. That's what we did. We merged those two movements, brought it to America, and then exploded to 82 countries.
You mentioned that difference. Run through maybe a few hand actions. Just explain to people what that means. And the famous call and response.
Yeah, I mean, so social movements are emerged out of the combination of like a new tactic and like a willing historical moment and also like a contagious mood. So Occupy had a whole series of rituals that we did that were...
Were they rituals? Rituals almost sound like... Go on, I'll let you finish, sorry.
Well, no, I think that they were rituals because I mean the thing about the social movement that's interesting is when we created Occupy Wall Street, I was working at a magazine called Adbusters, and Adbusters is based in Vancouver, Canada. It's not even an American magazine, and I was living in Berkeley, California, not even on the East Coast, and the movement was taken up by people in New York City who I had never met and never heard of, and they came along with their own baggage. They had ideas like don't make demands. So when we actually put out the call for Occupy, we actually said let's get in the assembly and come up with a demand. And then the people in New York were like, "Well, we believe in prefigurative anarchism. We don't believe in demands." And so the rituals. The reason why I call them rituals is because in New York we had a whole series of things like there was twinkle fingers to show us that you agreed with something. You put your fingers down to show you disagreed with something. We had the people's mic, which is that you would basically chant what someone was saying in order to broadcast it without microphones to larger audiences. But when those rituals translated to other environments,
so you would say,
you say, "Hello, everyone,"
and everyone in the room would go, "Yeah, you're terrible," but you get the idea.
They say, well, we started by saying, "Mic check," and everyone says, "Mic check," and then whoever said "mic check" gets to be listened to. And that was an amazing and powerful experience because part of what social movements do is, the theme of this conference is emotion, and part of what Occupy did is that it was a tremendous sense of belonging to sit in a space and chant each other's words, right? So I think that then those things, we would see those behaviors repeated without a consciousness about why they were being done in other environments. So it became self-destructive. I mean, I think the thing about social movements is that it's very hard for them to change. So even when Occupy started to fail, we weren't able to actually change the tactics of the movement, which is something that I think all social movements subsequent to Occupy have also had trouble with.
Do you think Occupy failed? In the sense of the Rebecca Solnit sense of the word. Look, there's someone here who was inspired by what you did, and she's still going, and there's thousands of kids on the street still going.
Look, it has to do with the definition of success. The definition of success for an activist in 1917 was my movement overthrew the government and we are the ones in power, right? Now the definition of success has become I'm at a conference of powerful elites and they are using my words, right? And I'm glad that you're using my words, but that's not success. Occupy's not in power. The 99%'s not in power. I have, so... And similarly, I think that there's a real danger we have to ask, why are activists even being brought to this community of elites? Why are we being listened to? What is it that we're providing the elites? So I think that, yes, Occupy was a constructive failure. It didn't, obviously it created a new generation of activists. It did lots of positive things. But does the 99% have more power today than we did when Occupy started? No. Absolutely not. Did Occupy, even the Arab Spring, all of these movements, did Occupy manage to overthrow the power of money in our democracies? No. So there's positive things that came out of it, but to call that a success is to degrade the meaning of activism to a point where it becomes social marketing. And social marketing has its role, but we need that old kind of activism where literally it meant this movement's going to take power away from the people who have power.
I disagree.
Well, I think that there is basically a global culture of dissent. And so with Occupy, what happened is if you look at the sociological data of who took part. So Occupy spread, first of all, let's remember, to 82 countries in 1,000 cities. So it was it was everywhere for that brief period of time. And if you look at who took part in the social movements, they shared a few common features, which is that they were what is called like the cognitariat. They were overeducated, highly indebted, digitally enabled young people. And that was true whether or not you looked at the protests in Russia or the protests in America. So it's part of it is that I think we are part of there's these global cultures of dissent. But getting back to this point of like anti-globalization, I think that when the anti-globalization movement started in 1999, it definitely was anti-globalization, and I think it became something like alter-globalization, which is what you're kind of referring to. And I think that part of what happened is that we had to absorb the global structure because we were fighting global forces. And so what's happening now is that activism we are globalists. At least I'm a globalist because we build global social movements in order to solve global social problems. That's I think one of the kind of distinguishing things is that we ended up accepting that yes, you need global institutions. We just want global like kind of activist-y institutions, I would say, or that activism itself becomes a global institution, perhaps. I think it gets back to this question of revolution versus reform. So I think that if you look at the history of social protests on the left, we were extremely successful. We had the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the American Revolution, French Revolution. We decolonized Africa, etc. But those came with tremendous amount of pain. We had the gulags and stuff. Like there was a kind of a disavowal of revolution among the left after we saw what the consequences of revolution were. So I think the left has tended towards reform. And on the right, I think it's a different experience. I think the reason why you're saying that they're more effective, quote unquote, is because they've gone for power and through electoral means and otherwise. They've literally gone for power. Whereas if you look at what the left was doing after the failure of Occupy Wall Street, it was we just doubled down on street protests. We had Black Lives Matter. We just had endless street protests. Very, very, very little attempts at actually gaining power. I think the left is afraid of power in a certain sense. And I'm talking about the radical left, not the elite left, which I think the elite left really wants to hold on to its power and is scared of losing its power. But I'm talking about the capacity of social movements. I mean, point to a left.
Why are they afraid of gaining power?
Because look what happens. Like, even if you point at the glorious, like, the French Revolution, the French revolutionaries put people onto barges, had mass, kangaroo courts, and then drowned them in mass. Like, all of the leftist revolutions, if you look at what happened, was horrible. And I think that this gets back.
Can we say that was a long time ago at this point?
No, I think that's deep in our DNA, which is that I think that we're still afraid to open that can of worms. I think that we're not like this. In the opening panel, someone asked, what's the pain we're willing to take? And I think the left is not willing to say, look, I'm going to have a revolution knowing that horrible things are going to happen because it's somehow necessary. That's the thing is, I think that the Russian revolutionaries, the Chinese revolutionaries, they understood that horrible things happen in revolutions, but it was necessary. And I think the left is very scared of saying, I'm going to take power and institute my popular will, because look at the consequences. No, I mean, I don't want to go so far to say that all protests are failures, because I think that there is, like I said, I think that a revolution would be a success, at least temporarily.
Well, if they're successful, they get rebranded, is what I'm trying to say, right?
Yes.
That's just a protest, right? Oh, it was an uprising, right? Kind of thing.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, I think maybe that if they stay within the level of protest, they fail. But I want to respond to this question of like kind of what's new, because I think that what is new is that I think that governments and elites are starting to understand that their power cannot function without some sort of interaction with social movements, even more so that they might actually need social movements in order to achieve the things that they want to achieve. And I think that that's what new is, that the nature of power is changing. You can no longer be a superpower who just has material superiority and therefore gets to dictate onto the world. You now need to be able to demonstrate a kind of engagement among your citizen population in order to kind of achieve these things. So it's both demonstrating an engagement among your population, but also realizing that these, like climate change, income inequality, these things will only be solved through some sort of collaboration with global social movements. So I think that what's changing is this conception of protest and activism as an adversarial force, and instead we're going to see governments who start to realize that their power is derived from their capacity to work with social movements or even create their own social movements, which frankly gets back to kind of, I think, how it was with, earlier revolutionary movements.
You write that we need to move to a more nuanced theory of protest. Actually, protest failure, I should say. What's so unnuanced about our current theories of protest failure and why they fail?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that most activists ascribe their failure to either police repression or a failure of kind of tactics and strategy. which I think that actually what's happening is that there's something deeper. On the one hand, I think that protests are failing because the activist culture that we have is broken, so that we are not the activists that we need. I'm including myself in that, and that's I think that's kind of a sad realization that there's something about activist culture itself that is unable to withstand the tremendous pressure to conform to movement orthodoxy, and that's why you see activists repeating the same failed tactics and behaviors, such as organizing one-day large-scale marches and stuff like that. So I think that what's broken is a kind of activist culture, but I think that also getting back to my earlier point, there is something about movement's relationship to power that is shifting, and I think that both elites haven't caught up to that fact, and I think that movements also haven't caught up to that fact. Is that I think that the radicals of the past were much more sophisticated in their understanding both of social change and the history of attempts at social change. So, I mean, just if you read like Trotsky or Lenin or any of those older thinkers, the first thing that happens when you read that is like you're just lost. You're like, wow, I can't even understand the nuance between the different parties and ideologies that are arguing with each other. I think that's true. I think that today's level of discourse about social change and activism is very much lower than it was 100 years ago, and I think that comes out in a lot of ways. I think that they were much. Is
it lower than it was 20 years ago?
I think that the breakdown happened. I mean, if I were going to put my finger on when the breakdown happened, I think that it started to happen. Like I was saying earlier, around the 60s or 70s, with a kind of disavowal of that history. I think that there was this kind of movement against. No one wants to say that they're a Leninist or a Stalin. I mean, some people, no average person wants to say that. Whereas I think that there was a.
Can we say no one should want to say that?
Well, I don't know if we should or shouldn't. I mean, I think that the issue is that most of us agree that we should not, and I think that with that has been a tremendous loss of a kind of complexity of thought. I think that today's people, activists, myself included, I'm not saying I'm anywhere better, but I'm saying that today's activists would have a lot of difficulty parsing the sophisticated intellectual and historical and political arguments that would have been commonplace to a worker who was part of the Communist Party 100 years ago.
But then people don't know that much about the Bible anymore, and that turns out to be really important to culture. And yet we still have cultural conversations that are incredibly complex. I mean, I could probably talk to almost anyone in this room for about 4 hours of Game of Thrones. I mean, maybe that isn't Game of Thrones isn't clearly the Bible, but people have complex conversations. It's just they're not about certain things, and they are about certain other things. You could also have we're about to have a incredibly complex conversation about new digital methods in about 1.5 minutes when I shut up. There are new conversations going on, though. Does that? I mean, why harken back to the past?
I think what I'm trying to say, like, if you look at like Lenin, and they studied, for example, you give a specific example, they actually studied like the Paris Commune and developed theories for why the Paris Commune failed, and then used those theories to change their behaviors when their turn came. I think that today's activists have lost a lot of that sophisticated nuance, such that we don't have a theory for why the Russian Revolution changed, or what we would do if we were the Russian revolutionaries, because we don't want to be the Russian revolutionaries, and also because we don't have that capacity anymore. So I think that means that if you were to transport back in time and have a conversation with the average activist in the past, I think we would be out of our depth, myself included. I think we would just be like, whoa, I can't even understand the difference between Menshevik and Bolshevik, and why does this matter? And like, we would just be out of our depth. I think that's the danger of activism today. Yes, one of my secret passions is I'm way into cryptocurrency. I mean, Bitcoin was the inventor of Bitcoin, anonymous inventor of Bitcoin, embedded a reference to the financial collapse in the original source code. And so I've been following Bitcoin since basically Occupy Wall Street, because I remember they were a similar kind of concept.
You're born at the same moment. Yeah.
Yes, they came out of the same kind of. They were a different form of protest. And so I think that, absolutely, I think that one of the things that is developing, which will have a tremendous impact on the future, is the development of smart contracts, moving a kind of distributed governance to a kind of decentralized way. But I also think that there's a tremendous need for skepticism. I think it's very dangerous. If you look at like the distribution of wealth within cryptocurrency economies, it's even worse than our current economy.
That's true.
The distribution of wealth among Ethereum and Bitcoin is even worse. And so it's like one step forward, 2 steps back in this weird way. But I would rather take that step forward, because I do think that smart contracts, cryptocurrencies offer some sort of way out.
Yeah. And then the general idea is that, for example, you could run insurance systems, you could run governance systems, you could run any organization in a way that, you know, there wasn't necessarily any equity, right? Or if you wanted to run big platforms like Uber, say, like you didn't have to have an Uber in the middle, right? You could just have these things, and you can have these things decentralized. And then people are building them, and they've got billions behind them. So it's not like they're just sitting there tinkering away in their garage. They're actually well funded.
Yes, they are a demonstration of a kind of leaderless model. But I mean, oftentimes the idealism of cryptocurrency outpaces the reality of cryptocurrency.
Sure.
But the idealism of cryptocurrency is great, and I've been an early adopter myself. Yeah, it's wonderful. I want to answer this question here real quick. I would just say that for young activists, I think the most important thing is to never protest the same way twice. I think that the continuation of the same protest tactic oftentimes is why movements fail.
Which is weird because
I did it already 19 times, so
right.
You told me a while ago.
But isn't persistence the thing?
No, I think that the way that the status quo works is that it becomes more and more resistant to the repetition of the tactic. There's something about the social organism that inculcates itself. I would say that they are already training to deal with that tactic times 10. Like they see the tactic and they train to defeat it. Yeah, absolutely. I agree that a revolution is necessary, and I think to use your paradigm, the challenge is to get the under 30-year-olds to want to have power. I think that the issue is that the under 30-year-olds, maybe even under 50-year-olds, it's like out of fashion to want power because we think it's somehow dirty or bad. I don't know the reason. So I think that absolutely, if we could get under 30-year-olds to suddenly be like, we need a revolution and our generation is the one to do it, then I think we would see some beautiful things. But I think until then, we're just going to be kind of spinning in this circle.
That was great.